Welcome to the second part of the debuted episode of the Mendez Movie Report Podcast, covering film news that caught my interest for the week of April 27th, 2026. I am your host and namesake, film critic Louis A. Mendez. If you want to check out more of my work, you can visit mendezmoviereport.com or find me on all social media, whether it be Letterboxd, X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Reddit, or even award expert Angle Derby, all under Mendez Movie RPT. Let's get to what I think is probably the biggest news at the moment as we wait for Cannes and obviously talking about whatever the latest movies are. And that is the fact that the annual Cinemacon was recently held in Las Vegas like it is every year, with studios showcasing and previewing their upcoming theatrical releases for the exhibitors. And for me, personally, I would say that the biggest news was the public debut of the teaser trailer for Godzilla Minus Zero. As I said in the past, in part one of this episode, Godzilla is definitely why I am a movie fan. Godzilla Minus One was my favorite movie of 2023. It was the only movie I was willing to rank over Oppenheimer that year. And it is easily my most anticipated film of the year. And the teaser that we saw, I thought was a very good teaser to really hype things up. Seemed to be well received. There was an incredible shot regarding the Statue of Liberty where Godzilla looks smaller to the Statue of Liberty than he really is, and then you realize as the scene progresses. There has been a lot of speculation and rumor on exactly what the story for this movie is going to be, and I can tell you that sources close to me seem to indicate that this is going to be a monster versus monster film. Nothing has been officially announced, but the hints that I've heard is that might involve King Ghidorah. And for those of you who don't know, who are not big Godzilla fans, Ghidorah is obviously a three-headed dragon who Godzilla's fought multiple times. Recently, we saw him in Godzilla King of the Monsters from 2019, an incredibly divisive and critically panned film that I personally enjoyed a lot, and it was one of my favorite films of 2019. But that was the last time that we got to see Ghidorah on screen. And I will say that regardless where people fall on the debate around that movie and whether it worked for you or not, I did think that the portrayal of Ghidorah in that movie in particular was really probably the first time that we got to see him actually live up to the aura and threat, because there's always been one of the things that there's been, you know, maligned of Ghidorah, but the fact that Ghidorah has always seemingly been not that big of a threat. But again, nothing has been officially announced. But what I've heard is that that's probably where we're headed. But we'll see when we get more actual news. Of course, we also got more hints and news about the way that Avengers Doomsday was very well received. Digger, which Warner Brothers is going all out. Warner Brothers is not sitting here and just resting on their laurels because they just had such an amazing award season. The very next day after the Oscars, they were already doing this big premiere event for the Doom Part 3 trailer. They clearly are going all in on trying to make that Return of the King situation. I don't know if they'll get to, but that's a conversation that we can have when I get to talk about my debuted Oscar projections in a couple weeks. And they are going all in on Digger and trying to really sell it with Tom Cruise. They actually went to Coachella and set up this massive giant shovel to get people talking and get the buzz going around Digger. But yeah, I heard Doom Part 3 was apparently very well received as well in the convention room. Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day. And what's wild about this is that apparently the things that we have not gotten to see in the trailer, like the aliens and such, they did show this to CinemaCon attendees. But apparently for everything that they have shown regarding that, apparently they did not have not shown anything whatsoever to the public or to the Cinemacon attendees regarding the third act, which is pretty interesting to me. Disclosure Day is going to be interesting because it is Steven Spielberg's return to the summer blockbuster. It is his return to genre filmmaking after a couple years. There's been a lot of speculation. Can this be a Best Picture contender? I personally have my doubts about that, even though I am hoping to really love the film. And it's kind of crazy to think that this movie is actually a little over about a month and a half away or so as I'm recording this. So it's getting here closer than we realize. And of course, The Odyssey, which is arguably the most anticipated film for most people. Christopher Nolan's follow up to Oppenheimer, his attempt to bring to screen one of the greatest, if not potentially arguably the greatest story ever told, with the story of Odysseus trying to return to his family. In what ended up being a very, very long journey. And I'm extremely excited for this movie. If it were not for Godzilla minus zero, this would be my most anticipated film of the year. And apparently, everything that we have heard in regards to what CinemaCon attendees got to see and what we have not gotten to see yet is that it is really going to be awe-inspiring. And a lot of people are arguing that this should be considered the initial Best Picture winner, competitive to win Best Picture front runner. We'll see. I'll try to analyze that personally. As someone who did correctly predict last year's Best Picture winner from the very beginning all the way to Oscar night. I don't know if I'm going to pull that off again, but I will definitely try. But I won't review my Oscar projections until after the Cannes Film Festival comes and goes, because I do want to wait and see what if the Cannes Film Festival gives us at least any early clarity on that. But for the most part, when it came to big reveals in such a CinemaCon, I think theater distributors are really, really excited about what's coming down the pipe. Last year was kind of a mixed bag for distributors. There were a lot of, they really had to wait till the end of the year to get a lot of the big movies that made a lot of money for them. And even then, Wicked for Good made about $200 million less than the last movie. Fire and Ash did not break the $2 billion mark. I think it made about $1.4 billion, which is still ridiculously impressive, especially for something that isn't some like big IP franchise that people are constantly turning at. The fandom for Avatar isn't like a MCU, so it is impressive that the movie still made 1.4 billion. But I think the funny thing about it is that the 2025 box office was actually better than the 2024 box office, all in all. But I think and we're already seeing it from some of these early films of this year. This is shaping up to be 2026 to be a really big bounce back year for theatrical distributors. And I think the sense of that was definitely there in CinemaCon. From based on what I've been told, what the attendees said, the energy that was supposedly in the room for all of the presentations, and I think a lot of theater owners, a lot of those folks who love the cinematic experience of going to their local theater, have a lot to look forward to as we get ready to really ramp this up with the summer box office season about to begin. Meanwhile, there was also an interesting moment over at CinemaCon when Sony executive Tom Rothman basically told the exhibitors, the attendees at this event, to get off the ad crack. Now, I think he definitely had a very populist message here, though I will also talk about what apparently was the response and the backlash from those exhibitors. But this comes from Brent Lang's reporting over a Variety, and what he writes here, and this is just a couple lines into the article. I'm not going to try to read all of it. Tom Rothman said, "Get rid of the endless advertising and substantially shorten the long pre-shows." He and Rothman is the chairman and CEO of Sony's Motion Picture Group. Um, he did this while, of course, teasing the studio's upcoming slate of things. Rothman noted that frequent moviegoers now show up half an hour late to avoid all the spots, something that reserved seating has made easier than ever before. Rothman says that means that many people don't even see the trailers, which results in enticement gone to waste. And I will tell you right now, I used to be somebody who was obsessed with having to get there on time, knowing full well that I was going to have to sit through trailers. I didn't mind sitting through trailers. I thought it was kind of part of the cinematic experience. Now, I honestly would try my best to show up as late as I can to get away with still seeing the movie as a whole. These ads that we have to sit through now before the trailers are ridiculous. I'm all for sitting through trailers to excite me or tell me about movies that are coming up. There's no reason I need to sit through all ads that I expect to see on TV or on the cheaper streaming bundles. When it comes to Regal in particular, it's out of control. I mean, you basically sit through about 10 minutes at least of ads when the starting time is supposed to start. Like, it's really gotten out of control, and I'm in complete agreement with Rothman here. The ad crack, as he calls it, has been getting ridiculous. He also went on to talk about he wants longer windows, and of course about asking for more original IP and such like that. And as the article finishes off here, Rothman noted affordability is by far the number one economic issue among the majority of Americans going to the movies. Whoa, I got issues for I got news for you, Rothman. That is, affordability is the number one issue for everybody in America right now. Rothman said that pushing cinemas to find ways to offer cheaper alternatives for audiences worried about paying their bills. And look, I don't disagree with anything that Rothman said. However, the exhibitors who were there and apparently weren't too happy with hearing this did point out afterwards that the prices or the fees that the studios are charging to show their movies have gone up, and the exhibitor said that they believe that if he wants to put his money where his mouth is, to lower the fees so they won't have to rely on getting more ads in there. And of course, another big thing that's been the popcorn buckets, which I think the popcorn buckets are getting a little out of control, but I think Rothman's asking for them to get off the ad crack is something that I agree with. But I agree with that as a populist. I'm not the businessman that these exhibitors are. And I also agree with what they have to say about maybe lowering those fees so that they can afford to get off the ad crack. Meanwhile, Steven Spielberg was announced as a major honoree for the America 250 celebration that will be coming up for this 4th of July, obviously recognizing 250 years since America came to be in the United States. And this honor recognizes him as a defining figure in the legacy of American cinema. And, I got to tell you, I've in the past decade, any sense of patriotism that I used to have has been completely sucked out of me. I have no interest in this America 250 celebration personally. I kind of roll my eyes at it, to tell you the truth. when you look at all the things that are happening in this country, when you look at the choices that this country has been making over the last 10 years, it's very, very hard for me to feel any kind of sense of pride of this country. And, it's unfortunate that we really couldn't be at our best as we are coming up on the 250th anniversary. Um, that being said, if they are going to do this celebration and they are going to have Steven Spielberg as their choice for who defines American cinema, I do think that is a good choice. It's hard to argue with it. Spielberg is one of the clearest representations of American blockbuster filmmaking at its best. He's not my personal go. He's not even my personal goat when it comes to living directors, but he's undoubtedly directed some of the greatest films of all time. He's undoubtedly the face of, when you think of directors, particularly American directors of his time. The man you think of is Steven Spielberg. It is kind of wild how Spielberg he really has become sort of the veteran guide in Hollywood. But it is kind of crazy that you can still go back and watch when he was this 27-year-old dude trying to make a miracle happen with Jaws, and then his family complaining when he didn't get that directing Oscar nomination from the Oscars. But yeah, I mean, very, very well deserved for Spielberg. Stepping out of the Cinemacon news, there was some panic happening on social media the last couple of days because Letterboxd, the movie logging site that has really made a lot of Gen Z tap into becoming cinephiles and moviegoers, and which has been a massive help for people like me in discovering a lot of older classics. I do think Letterboxd, the way that they present films on their interface, is a lot better than what we see in IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes, which is why I personally became a godsend for me. But it apparently it is reported considering selling a major stake, which of course raises questions about the future of the increasingly influential movie logging platform. Look, I am very, very concerned about this, but I'm also not trying. I'm trying my best not to push the panic button. I understand the allure to sell this thing because it is so hot right now, and Letterboxd has been, they've been increasingly getting a lot of cool features. They're getting more mainstream coverage. Movie studios are starting to use them to help with marketing their movies. I like a lot of the new perks as a patron member. But the thing is that Letterboxd has also been doing a lot of populist things, such as not raising prices. Letterboxd is one of the very few places that's not hike prices up for their premium offers, which has been very enticing for me. It's like, just pay $50 for the year and you get all these cool features with your Letterboxd, which I've loved to use. If a new corporate entity comes in, I can absolutely see a situation where that corporate entity would hike prices, and that corporate entity would not understand the love of cinema that the Letterboxd current leadership probably does. So this is something that I'm going to keep my eye on. But I would really, really like it if Letterboxd did not regress because of a corporate takeover. But again, I'm going to try my best not to hit the panic button. I really, really hope that 10 years from now we're not saying to each other either hey, remember when Letterboxd was actually good, or even worse, hey, remember that Letterboxd thing? But again, it's just something to keep an eye on. And I did want to take the time now to note that I was recently a guest of Matthew Anderson's Patreon version of his the Lone Screenplay podcast. He refers to it as the After Hours podcast, and he had me on as a guest to talk about one of my all time favorite films. And when I say all time favorite films, I talk about this movie's in my letterbox four. To speak of the devil, and that is 2017's Phantom Thread. We had a really good discussion about the movie, why we both love it. It was nice for us to agree because we disagreed when I was on his podcast before to talk about Conclave. He was not a big fan of it. Conclave was my number two film of 2024. And, and I also talked about the evolution of me and Phantom Thread because that was a movie that was not my favorite film coming out of 2017. Coco was my favorite film coming out of 2017, but as the years have gone by, Phantom Thread has climbed to become easily my favorite film of 2017, and it's now in competition to potentially be my favorite movie of all time. I really, really adore that film. I've seen it plenty of times now, and we got to talk about it on the podcast. So if you're interested to hear our conversation, and of course we get into awards talk because it did win the Oscar for Best Costumes. It's also infamous for one of the big surprise Oscar nomination performances because it was not expected to be nominated for Best Picture and Best Director or Best Supporting Actress. It was supposed to be like a few tech things and Daniel Day-Lewis, and it ended up way overperforming and getting some big nominations, including getting into the Best Picture lineup. Even with it, and it wasn't a hard 10. It was 2017, so there was still a sliding scale situation. So there was a lot of passion that got that movie into Best Picture at the end there. So we break it down and talk about it. Now, once again, I will tell you, this is the Patreon version of his podcast. So I will tell you that you do got to spare $3 is what he's asking for a monthly into the Patreon version of his podcast. But I thought we had a really good discussion, and I do think it's worth your time if you are a fellow lover of Phantom Thread, or even if you're not that crazy about Phantom Thread, but they want to kind of hear, our argument for it or our thoughts on its awards path back there in 2017. So yeah, check it out if you get a chance. And I think the time now has come to cover what was the big, obvious movie event of this past weekend, and that was the new musical biopic or Michael, covering Michael Jackson. And I kind of hinted that I was gonna wait to for this second part to talk about this movie because this movie has ended up moonwalking into discourse over the constant argument about critic scores versus audience scores. And look, let me just talk about the review, my personal review of the film first. I ultimately found this to be an incredibly middling biopic film overall. This movie has no personality whatsoever and gets by on good to great performances and the cheat code of having in your this at your disposal an incredible soundtrack because Michael Jackson made so many freaking bangers. Oh, and on top of that, the movie covers from 68 to 88 his most popular songs. So you got a bit of a Wicked Part One situation here, because it has been basically announced that there will be a sequel, which reportedly will be called Michael colon Jackson. That's apparently what I think they should just call it Jackson personally, but there will be a second part with the aim for it to come out in 2028. And the movie is doing incredibly well at the box office, which I will talk about later on as we look at how the key stories from the box office from this past weekend. The movie did not get great critical reviews, but it got great audience scores. This film is ultimately Bohemian Rhapsody all over again. whether you were a fan or not of some of the recent musician biopics, I do think that there was a I think there was a personality and a style that they all had, whether they were for you or not. You see Elvis, you know that's a Baz Luhrmann movie, and that movie does the whole typical cradle to grave thing, but it does it with this personality that Baz Luhrmann has, where you're basically going to go on a ride while doing the typical cradle to grave thing. Maybe you liked it, maybe you didn't. There were a lot of people who were very passionate about that movie, ended up getting to Best Picture. It was one of my favorites of that year, even though I'm not blind to of the criticisms towards that movie. Uh, then you take something like Maestro. I mean, Maestro had its distinct style. There's a reason that Bradley Cooper got a directing nomination at BAFTA for it. He made it so that every different timeline of that movie had its own style that was different from the other. He had some incredible directing choices and inspirations and transitions with that movie. And he made the movie kind of aimed to be a marriage story, which I found to be incredibly affecting. As Maestro was one of my favorite films of 2023. As we all know, audiences, however, were not that crazy about that movie. My wife thought it was boring, and meanwhile, I cried when I went to see that movie at my screening. And then, of course, you got something like, say, a Springsteen Deliver Me from Nowhere from last year, where it did end up being sort of this introspective film that focused on the making of the Nebraska album. And, I like Springsteen. I found it to be pretty enjoyable. It wasn't one of my favorite films of last year, but I found it to be pretty enjoyable. And it made me want to check out the Nebraska album. And even if you take something that I didn't like A Complete Unknown, I did not like that movie at all. In fact, I liked that movie overall less than I did Michael. It was easily my least favorite movie of those that year's Best Picture nominees. Yes, I'd even rank it lower than Emilia Perez. But there were people who really fell in love with that movie to the point that there is a debate. Was it number 5 or number 6 on the first ballot for Best Picture? I argue it was number 6, but there's a strong case to be made that it was number 5. That movie is a vibes movie that tries to be, focusing on Bob Dylan and where he was as the folk scene was going through a transition uh, during the 60s or so when that movie is set. I really don't think Michael has any kind of personality like that. Like Bohemian Rhapsody, it's like we're just gonna go from start to finish here, cradle to grave sort of situation. Um, Now, Michael, to be fair, doesn't do the cradle to grave thing. It's focused from 1968 to 1988. But what you do get from those 20 years is really just montages and concert scenes and music video recreations. And again, you get away with the fact that you're going to get to listen to bangers. There were plenty of times that I had a smile on my face and started getting excited because I knew one of the great Michael Jackson songs were going to come on. Unfortunately, that's not, that it wasn't because of the movie. The movie, everything else about the movie was generic with the exception of the performances. Jafar Jackson has incredible performances, Michael Jackson. He, at the moment, would make my personal ballot for Best Actor. Coleman Domingo, there's been a lot of debate about his performance as Joe Jackson. I thought it was a great performance. He's currently, we'll see if he stays there, but he's currently on my personal ballot for Supporting Actor. I think the makeup work in this movie is good. Definitely would potentially be on my ballot. I think that's probably the movie's best chances for Oscars to get into makeup. The acting, we'll see how strong the state is. Uh, kind of getting to for Best Picture, given that it is doing great at the box office, it does have great audience scores. Well, the problem with that is that it has currently, last I checked, it's in the late 30s on Rotten Tomatoes. The last time that a movie that was in the late 30s on Rotten Tomatoes got into Best Picture at the Oscars was 1953's The Robe, and the problem with that is that is basically based on a lot of more modern reviews that have gone up regarding that movie, because The Robe was actually top 3 in getting into critics' best of list that year. So that movie has not aged well for a lot of people as time has gone by. I need to rewatch that movie. It's been a minute since I've rewatched it. But the contemporary critics really liked it. And because of that, I do think that Michael's in deep trouble for that Best Picture slate. But the Academy are not critics, but they're also not general audiences, because if they were general audiences, Wicked would have won Best Picture, not Anora, and Sinners would have won Best Picture, not one battle after another. So you do also have to keep that in mind. Now in terms of this discourse that this movie has kind of moonwalked into regarding audience scores and critic scores, look, I cover audience scores. I try to look at whatever the last weekend's big new releases, how their audience scores are shaping up. I'm a big believer that you look at audience scores if you want to figure out what the seating on the movie is when it comes to the awards contention. Because when you look at movies that are the front runners for Best Picture, and then they slip up late, there's all this talk about front runner fatigue. I think frontrunner fatigue is overrated. I think frontrunner fatigue it does happen. In particular, I think that happened big time in 1917, and it definitely happened in La La Land. But there is also the fact that sometimes critics will champion movies that don't have the greatest audience scores. The Academy turns their nose up at them, and they go for something a little bit more crowd pleasing and easier to digest. That happened with Coda versus Power of the Dog. That happened with Green Book versus Roma. So, I do think obviously there is a gap at times between critics and audiences. We just saw this with the Super Mario Galaxy movie. Even if you take certain situations like, say, Wicked for Good, Wicked for Good's audience scores were not as good as the first movie, but they were significantly better. Well, maybe saying significantly is a little bit too far, but they were better than critic scores. So there are times audiences and critics disagree. And again, it goes vice versa. I mean, Uncut Gems. Critics loved that movie. Audiences hated it. Now, one of the things I like to do is to look at the three major movie logging sites, and I have found that Letterboxd is probably your best shot to see as to what cinephiles, the hardcore cinephiles, are thinking. IMDb's good for you for cinephiles, but cinephiles that maybe tend to be more mainstream with what they choose to watch. And Rotten Tomatoes is definitely the quote unquote normie, sort of like aggregator, I would argue. Now, the argument that people have been saying when we see these kind of gaps is that critics have failed when audiences loved a movie more than they did. And that it is the job of a critic to sell a movie to audiences or to, be in line with audiences. That is not the job of a critic. PR's job might be to be that, pull that off. Critics is a different story. Film critics are there to watch the movie, analyze it, make our case for or against the movie. And then we move on with our lives. And maybe if the movie really sticks out at the end of the year, we want to put it for ballots for Best Picture and stuff like that. And then after awards season comes and go, we make arguments as to what is a movie so good that it should be considered part of the film canon. It is not our job to try to match with audiences. Uh, in particular, keep in mind that a lot of these audiences don't watch as many movies as we do. And they are going to have a different perception of comparing certain movies to one another compared to us. It does not bother me one bit when audiences like the movie more than I did. It has not even bothered me that much when audiences didn't like a movie as much as I did. Because film is subjective. And it should not be surprising when a movie that is a biopic that doesn't take any chances, but is going to hit with banger songs for a figure that some people think is unquestionably great. And that's one of my issues with the movie, which I forgot to mention, is that Michael Jackson is portrayed as someone who can do no wrong. Like, he is very venerated in this movie. It should not be surprising when you have that perfect recipe of things that you're going to get audiences and critics to disagree with one another. But it does not bother me one bit as much as some of these stands on Twitter might think otherwise. It doesn't even bother me when a movie does really well at the box office. Now, I would rather see better movies do better at the box office. I mean, Super Mario Galaxy is on track to make over $1 billion, and I think there are much better movies even this year that deserve that compared to Super Mario Galaxy. But, do I think I failed as a critic because I didn't like that movie? And audiences did, even though audience scores are actually significantly down compared to the first movie. No, it doesn't bother me at all. And people who think that this is that we consider as some kind of failure or loss when audiences disagree with us, I mean, I've got bad news for you. It doesn't really affect us that much. We really don't care. Now, is there a significant gap that has made critics, quote unquote, out of touch? I think this is overhyped nonsense, to tell you the truth. And one of the reasons that I think this is overhyped is that there was a great website called Critics Top 10, where you will get to see the contemporary reactions from critics as to what they consider to be the best films of each year. And I went back over the last couple of years to look at what were the 20 films that made critics' best of list the most, and compared them to see, okay, what were the audience scores for these movies? And almost every single movie that was made a lot of critics' lists over the last couple of years for the best in films of the year had good to great audience scores, including all of the movies that were getting pushed by critics to be the most popular among them, to making it to critics' best of lists. In particular, in critics' best of list for as their number one choice. Everything Everywhere had good audience scores. Oppenheimer had great audience scores. Anora had good audience scores. And One Band After Another had great audience scores. So if there's a big divide going on here, why is it that audiences really like the movies that are getting in contention among critics for what they think is the best of the year? I think that there's always conversation to be had, good faith conversation about audience and critics scores when they diverge like this. But if you're going to just come at it from this intellectual perception, I disagree with. In the same way that I disagree with critics who sometimes take part in this sort of snobbish, looking down on people thing of, well, the audiences don't know what's good for them sort of thing. At the end of the day, film is subjective. And I have a feeling that this is a subject that I'll be talking about and expanding on as long as this podcast exists, because there are going to be times when critics and audiences disagree. And once again, it's just the nature of the game, and I feel sorry for the the Michael Jackson stans who think that I'm wallowing in defeat because audiences like this movie more than I did. I would say the same thing that I said to the Super Mario Galaxy movie people who were running around claiming that people who didn't like the Super Mario Galaxy have never played a video game, even though I grew up playing Mario games. Um, Sorry, guys, it doesn't bother us. And honestly, a lot of us, it doesn't bother us if you like the movie more than we did. But if you are, if you want to go ahead and do this intellectual stuff, the data just does not back up the claims you guys are making. It just doesn't. Most movies that get championed among the best of the year by critics are movies that audiences also responded very well to. And again, like I said, there's a lot of ways I can break down and talk more about this as I record this at 12:30 in the morning, hungry. But I'll leave that for future conversation because I know this will not be the end of this conversation regarding audience and critics. But uh, this has ended up. Michael has ended up being a divisive movie, and for all of the heat that I've gotten on social media, where I've been called slurs on social media by the Michael Jackson stance, I locked this movie as 3 stars on Letterboxd. So they're angry at a guy who was barely positive on a movie that does have many flaws, and I can see why critics didn't respond well to it. Now, do I think that there were critics out there that thought themselves this is Bohemian Rhapsody all over again and we need to nip this in the bud ASAP? Yeah, I can see that there were probably critics that thought that way when they came into this movie. But I'm a big believer that consensus wins out. And watching that movie, and I've watched enough movies and been in enough screenings and talked to enough critics. I knew right away uh, why this movie was getting the reviews that it was getting. All right, so let's do a little bit of a tour here of this past weekend at the box office in terms of all the new releases we got. And once again, going right back full circle here, the music biopic Michael opened to over 200 million worldwide, even as critics largely panned it. The data I've got here right in front of me right now is 39% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 39 on Metacritic. Audiences, however, have been far more receptive with solid scores across the board. We're talking about 3.6 on Letterboxd, and keep in mind, Letterboxd is very cinephile centric, and it still has a debuted with a 3.6, 7.7 on IMDb, 97% popcorn meter rating, and an A minus cinema score. Those scores will go down in terms of those audience scores because they always do go down the bigger the sample size gets. But that is without a shadow of doubt one of the bigger gaps I've ever seen between audiences and critics. Meanwhile, David Lowery's latest film, Mother Mary, expanded its release this past week. And it's the A24 project faced mixed critical reception, 68% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 58 on Metacritic. I have seen some critics and cinephiles who absolutely raved about this movie, and I would not be surprised to see it later in a few year-end best of lists. That said, general audience's response have been more muted. 3.0 on Letterboxd, 6.0 on IMDb, and a 57% popcorn meter score. And honestly, I have to say that I personally agree more with audiences here. I logged this movie with the same stars I did Michael, 3 stars. I was not blown away by the film in any way, like others that I follow were. Look, this is pretty consistent with how Lowery's films tend to be received. Never forget, Green Knight, great critical scores, lousy audience scores. He's just a filmmaker whose aesthetic and style isn't accessible to a majority of audiences. Um, uh, and in terms of what was the movie that actually had the best audience scores among releases this past weekend, at least US release wise, the BAFTA winning critical hit I Swear, which finally arrived in US theaters, is pulling excellent audience scores, currently sitting at a 4.3 on Letterboxd and an 8.4 on IMDb. Right now, it's still on my watch list. I haven't seen the movie, but everything that I've heard, you will see why BAFTA loved this movie as much as they did. Now, outside of the box office, Netflix's straight-to-streaming thriller Apex debuted at a mixed critical score, 68% on Rotten Tomatoes, 57% on Metacritic. Audience reception has been underwhelming, 2.6 on Letterboxd, 6.2 on IMDb, and a 54% popcorn meter score. I checked this movie out for myself, and I will tell you, out of all the new stuff that came out this past weekend, this is actually my least favorite movie. I found it to be pretty mediocre overall, which is a shame because I actually think the first half was pretty decent, and then it kind of just got off the rails in the second half. It is interesting that we have this big new thriller coming out to Netflix with Charlize Theron and Taron Egerton, and I saw Charlize Theron doing some media, and if I had time, I would cover her ridiculous backlash comments at Timothée Chalamet. But the movie's just not been that well received by either critics or audiences. So that's your look at how things went in terms of new releases from this past weekend. As far as to what's going to be coming up for this weekend, we do have what I would personally consider to be the final event film of the spring box office, with the arrival of the legacy sequel, The Devil Wears Prada 2. It's kind of wild to think that The Devil Wears Prada came out 20 years ago, because I can still remember when I was in high school and that movie came out and all the marketing around it, and Meryl getting her Oscar nomination for it. And here's the crazy thing. I have never seen The Devil Wears Prada. I was obviously not a film critic at the time. I kind of, there's chick flicks were movies that I did not engage with, as some people would call Devil Wears Prada. And even with it getting to the Oscar thing, it never was like a Best Picture contender, or else I would have seen it. So I will be taking care of that blind spot going into the second movie, which I hope to do my first full, proper written review for the first that I've had in the newsletter for some time now. For Devil Wears Prada 2. If everything goes right, I'll be publishing that this Sunday, and we'll definitely be talking about it for episode 2 of the podcast next week. And I should point out real quick that expectations are that it should perform very well commercially. Angel Studios will set to release their long-delayed animated adaptation of Animal Farm, directed by Andy Serkis of all people. I'll have my thoughts up on Letterboxd, but I'm not going to be doing much in terms of reviewing this movie. The marketing has really not been for me. Some of the early buzz that I've heard about some people who've seen this movie is telling me that it's not going to be. It's going to be what I fear it is. Not very good. This movie has been like in or should say post-production hell, and it got bought up by Angel Studios, who their best movies are middling, and their worst movies are downright offensive. So I'm not looking forward to this at all, but I'll try to catch it for folks and see how it plays. I mean, my jaw dropped at that trailer, because I cannot believe that it's something as serious as Animal Farm is being treated the way that trailer showed. And quite frankly, especially coming from someone like Andy Serkis, Meanwhile, Netflix will offer their own other animated counter programming with Skydance Media Swap, which actually features voice work from our most recent Best Actor Oscar winner, Michael B. Jordan. And again, I'll be sharing my thoughts over on Letterboxd, but I'm not going to be planning to write an in-depth review about that one. And to finish things off, just some other non-movie stuff that has been on my mind. And I recently watched WWE's tentpole Super Bowl type event, WrestleMania 42. And I have to say, sadly, for a second year in a row, I did come away underwhelmed. Look, this isn't a wrestling podcast. I'll keep it brief here, but the corporate era of WWE has been a jarring shift. I mean, there's so many commercials, less running time for actual matches to watch. A lot of booking that seems to be celebrity based and based on creating moments without any plans for the follow through. But look, there were some great. Night one was atrocious. Night two had some decent matches. The main event was great. I thought it was the wrong winner, though. I'm not really interested in reheating these nachos of the Bloodline stuff. I am excited that apparently they want to eventually set up CM Punk and Cody Rhodes. So I'm excited for that. But overall, unfortunately, 2 years straight in Vegas, 2 years straight of what I found to be mid-lean WrestleManias, and I'm not particularly that looking forward to seeing WrestleMania be WrestleMania 43 to be basically WrestleMania Blood Money, as it will be in Saudi Arabia next year. Yes, Saudi Arabia will get to host the first ever international WrestleMania, not London, which is ridiculous. I also finished binging the Egghead arc from One Piece, and I do usually take breaks between arcs, but this one was really exciting. After nearly 3 decades, the series is clearly moving into its end game. Like, look, this series has been around for 3 decades, and it is wild. And I don't think I appreciated this when I was reading the manga, the source material, compared to actually watching it in action with the anime. We're watching people that have been in the shadows and have, from the very get-go of the series, now starting to get involved because we are getting to that end game. Now, I still think we're a good 5 to 10 years away from this series ending, based on its pacing and where things are in the manga right now. They did recently start up the Elbaf arc. But look, Netflix's live action adaptation, which has continued to gain traction in the US, especially with the second season bringing in new fans, which I also watched and I thought was pretty good. It is wild that One Piece is the best-selling comic of all time, and yet it's remained relatively niche in the States until recently. So I'm happy to see that's a big One Piece fan. Also, the NBA and the NHL playoffs are also underway, and it's been a rough start for me. My Miami Heat couldn't even get past the play-in tournament despite a 43-win season, and my Tampa Bay Lightning are locked in a tough opening round series, even after they won 50 games in the regular season and have home ice advantage. They are now down 3-2 in the series and are only 1-2 at home in this series. It's really pathetic to see no hunger, sense of urgency from them. As much as I would love to see the Lightning bring a 4th championship in my lifetime, but I mean, there's still a good chance I will. I mean, but I obviously sooner than later I would like. This first round has not exactly inspired confidence that this is going to be the year that they're going to go back and do another deep run. And that'll do it for this second part of this debut episode of the Mendez Movie Report Podcast. Remember, once again, that if you want to check out more of my work, you can visit mendezmoviereport.com or find me on all social media, whether it be Letterboxd, X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Reddit, or even Award Expert in Gold Derby, all under Mendez Movie RPT. Until next time, God bless, and do me a favor, go watch a great movie for me.